Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm the Capitol kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, this is the podcast for you. We want to invite you to please rate, review, share, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using. This is going to be the last episode where we are in the Loft podcast feed. We have our own separate podcast feed, so we definitely want you to subscribe to us in our specific feed. So please just search the Progressive Christians podcast and subscribe to us so you can continue to get the amazing content we are putting out. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and I'm your host. I'm also the lead pastor of the Loft Faith community in Westwood, California. This is a weekly podcast that features myself, along with my friends and fellow staff members of the Loft, Julia Black, who is our director of music, and Wesley Garcia, who is our director of Loft Connections. But this week, Wesley is not available, and so we called in an amazing, I don't want to call her a backup, but let's just say someone who can fill in the shoes as best as we can, our friend, Reverend Blair Stowe. Blair, how are you doing?
I'm excellent. I'm so excited to chat with you guys.
We're glad to have you here. So I'm going to say a little bit about Blair, just so y'all know who she is. Blair is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and she's a PhD candidate in practical theology at Boston University. We're not going to say too much about her dissertation because I said we're going to have her on again to talk about her research, because I think that's actually interesting to have a progressive conversation on evangelism, with that little teaser. But yeah, Julie, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, I'm still here. I'm all healed. I've been sick the last week, so now I'm all better. Today's the first day that I'm feeling better, but all good in the hood. Haven't left the house in 7 days. It's, a little stir crazy, but what can you do?
I know. You scared me when we were texting because I've had this cough for like 2 weeks, and you're like, you need to go to the urgent care. You might have what I had. And I'm like, oh Lord. I thought I just had
you would know if you had what I had. I was sick.
Yeah.
I was down.
I think I got some kind of TK virus or kindergarten virus or one of them things that you get that you just,
We call it the preschool plague in my house.
Yeah. That's basically it. You just get
it's just a never-ending something.
Yep. It's basically it. It's kind of where we're at now. So, I'm just trying to be okay with it. Now, in today's episode, we are going to be discussing the contrasting portrayals of masculinity between the Republican and Democratic parties, particularly what was on display at their respective national conventions and just the rhetoric around that. We're also going to be talking about the ways in which masculinity has been portrayed within conservative Christianity, particularly conservative evangelicalism. And yeah, that's kind of the gist of what we're going to discuss today. I'm sure some other stuff will come up as necessary. But Julia, I know you were the one who kind of, as we were mapping out what we're going to be discussing for the next several weeks, this was something that stood out to you on your watch of the Democratic National Convention with respect to just the ways in which Governor Walz, and I think you mentioned Doug, this showed you something stood out to you about how they were portraying what it meant for them to be a man that just was powerful for you. So if you can just share a little bit about what kind of came up for you, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with like these two energies that we all have, masculine and feminine energy. And I feel like we often, especially since the rise of Trumpism, we've spoken and we talk a lot about toxic masculinity, and we don't talk a lot about toxic femininity, which also exists. And we also have not seen, or there haven't been a lot of examples of positive masculinity being upheld generally in our culture. And to me, what it is an imbalance of the energy. So like, I mean, I'm a little witchy, I'm a little woo-woo, but like, I feel like what toxic masculinity means is like all masculine, no balance of feminine energy, not male or female. It's different. But I think of so much of what you see, like J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, this like locker room talk, rape culture, all of that is indicative of toxic masculinity. And what I felt so encouraged by when I was watching the DNC was the portrayals of positive masculinity and the way that Tim Walz obviously is a husband and father. I think the display of affection, that overt like show of love that his son Gus had, that people were like hating on, but this ability to show emotion, to show love, and not have that be seen as like weak or feminine, which I think for a lot of more conservative people, femininity is also conflated with weakness, which is like a whole other conversation. But like the way that Doug Emhoff so outwardly loves his wife, the way that, like, the fact that he's like, yeah, he gave up his lucrative work to go be the first second gentleman. So many men would not do that and would look down on that and would think that that's like some display of weakness. The way that he holds her in high regard and like supports her and has her back. It's just so, oh my God, we need it. We need it. Jesus, we needed it. So refreshing.
But it became like a whole theme. Like there were just lots of men like loving on their wives and like, and not in a weird, like, you know, like my smoking hot wife kind of creepy pastor way, but like talking about and celebrating the accomplishment of their wives and like talking about how proud they are to support them in the things that they're doing. And that takes a lot of courage in this society, honestly, but to see it displayed so consistently at the DNC was really refreshing.
I mean, I think that, you know, in terms of just defining terms, you know, the way I see toxic masculinity, and actually, Julie, I would say I do think the way you're discussing femininity and toxic femininity or all these other, they're all tied into the same broad conversation that I like to have today. Is toxic masculinity, as I understand it, or as I define it, will be this idea of what it means to be a man that asks you to dismiss or to push back or not embrace any part of your personality that's perceived to be feminine, to see it as a sense of weakness, as a sense of cowardice, and it denies you, I would argue, aspect of your humanity, because masculine and feminine are just ways in which we understand and perform our humanity. They're not like, this isn't genetic, if so to speak. So it becomes toxic when you think, well, for me to be a man means I can't actually do anything that's perceived to be feminine, right? I can't have emotions other than like a sex drive and to be hungry, right? I can't cry. I can't do all these other kinds of things. I can't love in a particular kind of way. Similarly, I would say with respect to, and maybe this actually would be an interesting podcast to do later on about toxic femininity. The first thing that came to my mind was the trad wife phenomenon, you know, and what that actually means, and its idea of being submissive and subservient as a way of modeling this biblical normative understanding of what it means to be a wife. So for me, I guess what I wanted to say is what I appreciated about Governor Walz, especially, was his idea of being able to have the kind of balance you're talking about, Julia. Like how he's like, and I think this is what the conservatives having a hard time critiquing him, because
They don't know what to do.
Because he was in the military. He actually, see, a lot of these people be having guns, like in their Christmas cards and whatnot. They just got big guns. They can't use the guns. They can't hunt. They can't do any of that stuff, right? And like, but that's what they portray. And I'm like, I'm from the country. Like I have shot like hunting guns. You know what I'm saying? Like, like I have shot a hunting bow and arrow, and I am black. I'm like, you know, but this is not a race thing as much. It is a country thing. I'm not trying to perform any of this stuff. And I think you see these conservatives try to perform masculinity in a certain way where he's like, no, this is who I am. I'm from this tiny town in Nebraska. This is how we grew up. But I also can cry. I can talk about my children. I can actually have raised a son that has the courage to cry in front of other people because he can say he loves his dad. I can also be the advisor for the LGBTQ student group, and it doesn't threaten my masculinity.
While being an assistant football coach, right?
Exactly.
That those two things are not in conflict.
Right.
Exactly. And so I think this is what he was able to do, especially that I think confuses and confounds the conservatives, because he does at his core hold both. You know, you can't get much more American than a football coach, and like and clearly a good football coach. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I'm like, that is, or I shouldn't say much more American, more masculine is right where I should use it. You can't get much more masculine in that particular kind of way, and I think they find it difficult because he's not performing; he's actually authentically being who he is.
I think that when people think about gender, it's hard for people to admit that so much of the gender is actually made up of so many different things. And what people are usually talking about when they're talking about the performative aspects of gender. And like, from what I see, masculinity appears to be a prison. And like, I don't know how any
men too. I mean, I think you're right. Like in that way, right? Masculinity, like toxic masculinity, sort of toss out another idea about the definition, right? It requires men to dehumanize themselves and to dehumanize others. And so, right, Dr. Carter was talking about this, right? They lose the ability to live fully into the fullness, pardon me. But like, yeah, to the broad expression of being human. So like in feminist studies, we talk about the basic definition of to be feminist is to support and uphold the full humanity of women. And toxic masculinity degrades the full humanity of men and degrades the full humanity of women. And I would say toxic femininity would do the same thing because it's not allowing either expression of gender to be a fully human expression of being a person alive in the world.
Right.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is we try to have such a narrow definition. We're like, oh, this is what, with respect to either, this is the way to be a man or this is the way to be a woman or any of those kinds of simplistic, narrow views don't allow, again, the full expression of humanity. And this is where I think it's sometimes I just be like, do these people read the Bible? That's all I be thinking. I'm like, because to me, it's like, if you read Paul writing in 1 Corinthians, talking about the body of Christ and talking about the plurality of what it means to be a part of the body and has other different expressions of what it means to be a part of this body. And what you hear them arguing over and over again is this idea of uniformity over and against unity. They think to be unified, we have to be exactly the same, to be uniform. Mm-hmm. And we don't. We just have to be connected, And I think that's why I think the metaphor of the body is extremely powerful and helpful and still relevant for today. And so, honestly, the other thing I want to say is I think the emergence of this culture, because it's always been, we've had patriarchy for forever. Patriarchy is woven into the biblical text, is woven into these different religious traditions. There's been pushbacks against it multiple times. But what I think the current rise stems from men who are trying to find reasons to explain away their inadequate success. Like, this is what, like, they're like, I haven't been able to do the things I think I want to do or I should be able to do, the things I should be afforded to, right, to be able to have, and they need to blame someone. So whether it be women, especially, or people of color, but then you have even men of color who want to blame women. They're just like, they're the reason why I'm not doing so good because they're not allowing me to get the shine that God has told me I should have. They're not getting in their right place and they're taking away credibility from me. They're trying to find a way to excuse their own inadequacy. That's what I hear when I hear them talking. This is where I'm like, Michelle Obama had it right. She's like, you know what? You haven't done anything in your life. You need to get off your behind and do something.
Mm-hmm. It's no longer acceptable to be a mediocre white man and then rise to the top. Like our society has shifted enough that still happens, right?
Just enough. It shifted
we still
just
celebrate
enough.
Mediocrity. Ijeoma Oluo, her book Mediocre, is all about that, like the rise of mediocre white men. Right. But I think that in general, society is starting to push back on that simply being mediocre and being male and being white is not enough to give you the keys to the castle anymore. You have to actually prove that you have the ability to lead and think and contribute.
And at the very least, if you don't have to show that, you need to then be comfortable with everyone constantly pointing out the fact that you're mediocre. And I feel like that's really like the difference. Is it's not that they're having a harder time getting ahead. It's that now that when they do get ahead, people are like, oh, it's fine that you're there. Just you don't deserve it. We can all agree that you don't deserve it. Right.
And I think that you're right. That makes, one of the worst or one of the most effective strategies to combat the rise of patriarchy, particularly the kind of rise that we see happening in Christian and political conservative spaces, is embarrassment. And that's what's happening right now. Like, they are just embarrassing them, like by what they're saying. They're just like, oh, this is, like Michelle Obama talking about the affirmative action of generational wealth, that kind of stuff, expecting to have an escalator. Baby. Yeah. It was helpful.
She dragged him.
She did. But in like a way where it's like, you don't have to talk about.
She wasn't mean.
Yeah. Just telling the truth.
Zero lies were told.
No, there was zero lies. But I think
she's using their same arguments and turning it back around, right? Like, oh, well, if you are a woman, if you are a person of color and you've risen to the top, then it must be a DEI hire.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if you're a mediocre white man and you've risen to the top, then it's because of who your daddy is, not because of what you've done in your life.
I mean, she didn't even say he was mediocre. She said he was fundamentally unserious. I mean, that's like less
worse.
mediocre. So
Still not alive.
And I think, again, so you have this rise of toxic masculinity right now, in part because it is a way to explain away, I would argue, some of the inadequacies that many men experience.
Well, and also I do think that it's important, though, to also acknowledge the way that it's tied to white supremacy, because the idea of masculinity is very specific. It's a very white Western, like these standards of masculinity that these men are trying to uphold and perform are not just general it's a very specific representation of white Western masculinity, and that it's the patriarchy and the white supremacy that people are pushing against, which is why we're seeing this like backlash.
Yeah, because femininity also, right? What we talk about as or what they would talk about as appropriate femininity is also very much white femininity.
Exactly that. Like their expectations, even, I mean, we'll talk about it, like the idea of like a traditional household. Who is that traditional for?
Yeah. And I mean, we're doing a whole series in the Loft, for those of you who are interested, in starting in the end of September on white Christian nationalism, where we're going to talk on all this stuff. But this is a perfect time to segue into, again, as Julie was just mentioning, talking specifically about how this has its deep roots in Christian theology, white Christian nationalist kind of theology. And so some of you may or may not be aware of this pastor. We're going to play a little clip from his podcast interview and then be able to respond to that. But his name is Pastor Joel Webbin. He's the president and founder of Right Response Ministries and the senior pastor of Covenant Bible Church, which is located on the north side of Austin, Texas. If you look at Right Response Ministries, what the first thing that stood out to me is the way he has the logo designed looks like the armor, kind of the facial armor for like a Greek military soldier. Yeah, it looks like something the men wear in like the movie 300, right?
Like
that's
a Trojan helmet. Yeah,
that's what comes up for me. So that just gives you an idea of the kind of vibe there is. And so we're gonna play that clip, and then we will come back and respond to it.
And just for the record, I think the 19th Amendment should be repealed. I think that because, well, first and foremost, because I'm a Christian, and that is the Christian position. Oh my gosh, you're saying that? Yes, that is the Christian position, is that households should not be divided against one another. So it's not just elevating a male vote, but it's elevating the household vote. We're saying that that society, if you break it down to the basic building block, is not atomistic as individuals, but molecular, being households. The way that God sees humanity is He breaks them down to families, and so that it's not just random individual atoms all bouncing around together, and 350 million atoms bouncing together in one nation, on one piece of land, but it's families. And so by repealing the 19th Amendment, just for the record, it's not just trying to take away a female vote, but it's trying to say, no, there's a family vote. Right. There's a household. And it's like, well, where do women get their voice? Where women get their voice is from their father, from their husband. If they're not married, it's from their father. If they're not married and their father's dead, it's from their brother, it's from their uncle, it's the men in their lives that love them.
All right. So that was interesting comments about women not voting and repealing the 19th Amendment and all that good stuff. So I want to sit back and turn it over to the well-educated women on the podcast. What do you all think about what Pastor Joel had to say about women not being able to vote, and that their votes are, that your uncle, Julia, your uncle is voting, his vote counts for you, right? That's what he said.
The thing that like upsets me the most is the statement about this is the Christian position. I need to be very clear. As a Christian, I disagree. I dissent.
Well, and also like it's not the Christian position, and the idea of the nuclear family being a Christian standard or it being biblical is completely made up. The nuclear family did not come into existence as a sociological concept until the 1920s. Right now, patriarchal ownership of women is a very, very long historical standing across multiple cultures, and the expectation of sort of men owning and taking responsibility for women is in the Bible, but it's not in the standards of the Christian new community that we see forming in the book of Acts and the epistles, right? What is weird about Christianity as it forms as an offshoot from Judaism is that women are treated as equals.
What?
And the Greek and Roman and ancient Jewish concept could not fathom that. And it was widows and wealthy women who were funding the movement and building house churches. And I mean, the idea that Christianity as its own religious community has ever been designed to be anything other than egalitarian based on the teachings of Scripture is just wrong. It's just wrong, because that's just not what we see in the Christian community. So not only is like the idea of the nuclear family not Christian, but the idea that women have no voice within Christianity is simply not the reality in ancient Christian history or in the scriptural text. And so it just drives me insane that we've created this entire historical myth around the place of women, quote unquote, based on Christianity, because it's just not true. It just proves that someone has not read scripture well, and it proves that they don't know anything about the history of Christianity. So I don't know what this quote unquote pastor is doing, talking about things he seemingly knows nothing about.
Get him, Blair.
Sorry, I'm just gonna
this is why I was like, let me just step back, because I do think this is what it's important for us to point out, that it isn't biblical. What he's trying to, at best, draw on is a pre-Christian, ancient Israelite community understanding of the family. And even then, they didn't operate in a democracy. They operate either in a monarchy or under colonial occupation. And while one may say the man was the quote unquote head of the household, the decisions in that space, when you look at the historical evidence, are always
made by the women.
Well, more democratic. I would say that more democratic than we like to think.
Didn't they manage the money? Didn't they like?
Well, women oftentimes they did more farming and agriculture than I think people believe. Like right now, and so this is getting into my world in food and in agriculture. Like the majority of farmers globally have always been women. Mm-hmm. Like food, that's why I would say food justice is a women's justice issue. And so and that's ancient. This is from ancient times. Like this has always been it. And so these are conversations that are always being formed in community. So I think he's drawn in these particular Hebrew Bible narratives and stories while not acknowledging the ways in which prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah especially, critique the ways in which those families were structured, or critique the kind of performance, but most especially, obviously, Jesus. And so his idea, and this is the scripture that first came to mind when he's saying that God has this idea for men to be not only the head of household, but to operate in this patriarchal framework, in that the votes and everything should be cast together. The first thing I thought was Matthew 10, when Jesus is actually talking about, this is the end of this Sermon on the Mount. And he's talking about how families are going to turn against each other because some people are going to become Christian and some people aren't, or they're going to follow the new versions of the law, because he's not trying to create a new religion. Jesus is pushing back on a kind of Judaism that has become entrenched in religious performance rather than actual transformation. And so it says right here, verse 34, don't think that I've come to bring peace on earth. I haven't come to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to turn man against his father, a daughter against his mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. People's enemies are members of their own households. And so he's not saying that to say that, every internalized household will have challenges. But what he is saying is that there are people within the same family who are going to struggle to, or have challenges with, accepting this new way of what it means to love God, to push back against these traditional structures of the law that have said, you know, as Jesus said, you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye. But I say, you know, if somebody hits you in the right cheek, turn to the left. You know, there's all these times of Jesus is saying, this is the law as you understand it. This is what it means to actually apply this today. There's this historical evolution of their cultural values that are supposed to be more about loving your neighbor as yourself rather than exerting power over another person. Like over and over again, this is so obvious and evident. But Blair, I think I'll say this last thing now. Turn it over. Julie, I know you want to say. You had the best argument when you say literally, what are you talking about, the early church, or and I would say especially through the Black church today, if you don't have women, actually, like women have been financing the church and running the church. Like
there
literally
are still more women Christians in the world than there are men. Historically, women converted first and brought their households with them. Through the history of the missionary movement, churches did not take off until women agreed to be part of the new community. Like women have been the drivers of the Christian faith since the very beginning. So the idea that, and this gets thrown around a lot in these patriarchal Christian circles where they're like, well, men, right, this men are the head of the household. Men have to be the spiritual leader and women need to submit to their husbands. And even that text that it's like referencing in Ephesians is women submit to your husbands, but also men submit to your wives.
Yep.
And they just conveniently forget that part. So the idea is not, yes, men get mentioned first, but what's being described is a co-equal submission as Christ is modeling that we all ought to submit to one another so that community thrives, and that is also going to transform the household, which is its own politic, right? Its own structure in ancient society. So it like I said, it's just lazy. It's just lazy.
It is
reading.
lazy. It's
lazy reading and lazy scholarship, if they even are doing scholarship. And it's, you know, I talk in progressive Christianity often that when folks accuse us of cherry picking, I'm like, well, we're all cherry picking, but we're just being honest about it. You guys are not being honest about it. And like you can only create a patriarchal Christianity if you choose very specific verses and ignore the rest, and very specific instances in Christian history and ignore the rest. Women are, again, overwhelmingly the leaders in Christianity, unofficially, but they're the ones who maintain Christianity and keep it going in multiple seasons of the Christian story.
How does a narrative such as like this idea of traditional family, which you mentioned earlier, Blair, only came to pass in like the 1920s, how has this taken? I mean, I imagine that it's just like a very specific American phenomenon, but it feels like where does this even come from? Like what he said was so horrific, right? Like, and it's not about Christianity. It's about these people hate women, which is like,
it's about power, right? It's about maintaining power. And so I will pitch a book, an excellent book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth by Dr. Beth Allison Barr. And she is an evangelical woman who grew up in complementarian circles. And we haven't talked about that, but like there are ways that people there's outright patriarchal Christianity, then there's complementarian Christianity, where people try to say like men and women were created different and to complement one another, but people shouldn't get out of their lanes. And then egalitarian Christianity, which I would argue is the biblical standing, where men and women are co-equal in their humanity and in their participation in the Christian life and in society. But Beth Allison Barr grew up in complementarian Christianity and was even a pastor's wife in a complementarian church. And both she and her husband had to, as she was moving forward in her scholarship as a Christian historian, was realizing the teachings of her church were just simply not in line with the history of the Christian story. And so she and her husband had to like undo all of that. And so it's part memoir and part really good historical text. And it really does like lay out, how did we come up with this idea that men are meant to be the sole spiritual, political leaders of the house, like that? It's because it's just not actually defended in the Christian story.
I think within the political sphere, Julia, the answer is Reagan. I think.
Well, it always is, isn't it?
And yeah, for the listeners of this podcast for a while, Reagan is like the
root of all evil.
Well, I mean,
Beginning of
one
the
might
end.
say. There's a reason why he has 6 letters in each of his names. So and he has 3 names anyway.
Oh my goodness.
I'm just saying. I'm just pointing out facts.
It's just an observation.
Just an observation. Just an observation. So
well, and also it was actually women who pushed this narrative in the rise of the feminist movement in the United States. The trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. Phyllis Schlafly and other Christian women came forward and basically argued that they wanted to be housewives, and the Equal Rights Amendment would remove their ability to do that. They also killed. There was a beautiful bill that was going to create standardized, subsidized childcare for kids under 5, and Phyllis Schlafly and her comrades, that's not the right word to use with her compatriots, killed it. And so we still don't have adequate or any kind of subsidized.
Phyllis and Reagan were working together, though. So
yes, and they worked together, and she helped support his campaign. So, like, it is also like women are also responsible for the subjugation of other women. So, yes, toxic masculinity is a problem. Yes, patriarchy is a problem, but women are also perpetrators of patriarchal ideas.
Just to put a bow on this part right here. So this was going to happen during Nixon's presidency when Reagan was the governor of California. And Reagan and Schlafly were able to persuade Nixon not to pass this bill. When it had bipartisan support, it passed and he vetoed it, right? So we could have universal child care, like back when people realized, this is kind of what we need. And now, when you have to actually share goods and services among a variety of people, people don't want it. So it is politically, and this is why but I'm so glad you're here, because we can make a clear connection between the theology and the politics, right? Like this is a kind of Christian nationalism thinking that's embedded in how much the way our country has done this. And it's like you said, I love the way you call it's lazy. And lazy kind of scholarship, lazy kind of politics. It's just it's lazy. And the last thing I'll say is I think that the challenge that confronts us as we move forward is continually making sure that we can respond to these critiques in a way that don't dehumanize the people who believe them, right? So the men who's saying it is like, because I think people are seeking and searching to find a reason to explain away their pain and suffering. And this is what I keep, what I remember whenever I go back to, I was just in Ohio teaching and literally at a school in the middle of tiny town, nowhere, Ohio. And it reminds me of how much people just want to understand how things got to be where they are and how they can heal and be better. And they'll believe a narrative if it feels right to them. And so much of what narrative they've been taught is white supremacy, it's patriarchy. And so it just fits into what they've already just always been inadvertently taught. And so we have to recognize that's what they've been taught and say, no, there's another way to explain this. It's actually the system has been set up for you to believe these things. It's actually undermining you. It's wealthy people. It's capitalism. It's this notion that we shouldn't share these goods, like that there's a small pie when we have, what's the word we used earlier? When Michelle Obama was critiquing Trump about having generational wealth as a form of affirmative action, right? Like there's all these other things that actually would make things equal, and you don't need to blame. Let's blame the correct people. As Barry says, blame the correct people. And within Christian theology, let's actually call out the bad scholarship, because we couldn't even find out where this guy went to school. Like we were looking, trying to figure out, and he has his whole ministry, his church, and this other stuff. And like, let's call out bad theology. Be like, no, this is actually terrible theology. Like this is it's just fundamentally terrible theology.
I say that bad theology is the root of all evil. I really do believe that.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly tied up with it.
100%.
Patriarchy, white supremacy. They all have like Christian theological misuse
underpinning, right?
Yeah. That undergird the myths. And I think you're right, Dr. Carter, that like if we're calling people's worldview a myth, that can be a different kind of traumatization where they're having to go through the process of reconsidering the world in which they live in. And it can be painful, and it's a kind of grief and mourning, and they have to be supported in building a space for themselves in the new world that they're coming to see. And so I think you're very, very astute to name that we need to hold compassion as well as like a firm hand of like, I will not let you continue to do harm, but I will love you while I teach you why.
Exactly.
I mean, I think as someone who has experienced deconstruction we say decolonization now, right? That's how we call it. As someone who went through that, it is hard. I can have compassion and empathy because I experienced it myself. That being said, because I've experienced it myself, it is confusing as to how and why people seem to struggle to even ask the most basic of questions. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
I mean, this is where for me, I get more upset with the pastors than the people in the pew. But I'm totally biased. I'm totally biased because as a pastor, I'm like, no, they bear moral responsibility for what they're teaching and giving people what they know is going to allow them to create a grift, quite honestly, to exploit people. I mean, I don't think it's hard to figure out why people are doing this.
Well, and, critique the mainline denominations of Christianity all day, but you and I had to go through 10 years of accountability before we could call ourselves reverend, right? Like, so the idea that you can just kind of wake up one day and decide to be a pastor and plant your own church, there can be a beauty in that, but there can be a massive amount of danger trying to spit theology without any system of accountability. So I think, we could talk a whole other series of podcasts on the problems with the main line, but at least we have a system in which we are connected to other people who have deeply studied and been faithful and committed to being faithful to how we are using theology and how we are organizing communities of faith. And that helps to undercut some of this, I would say, abusive use of scripture and abusive use of the Christian story.
Yeah, to me, it's like I always say, like, if you're going to build a house, do you want to just have someone who's did a little bit of reading on architecture and it's kind of handy, and it gives you good vibes? Like, yeah, no, let's hire this person to be the contractor for my house and actually manage everything. Of course you wouldn't. You would hire someone who's a professional architect who has demonstrated examples history of building these really successful houses that don't fall over as soon as they leave. Why would you then not apply that same kind of strict logic to the person who's helping you build your literally your spiritual house, like what's going on inside of you?
And also, Dr. Carter, only men build houses. Don't you know that?
Oh, good Lord.
Not only that, all men build houses. That's a real man can provide shelter.
Yeah. I used to be able to do that kind of stuff. Now I'm like less handy and more of an academic. So all that stuff is gone.
I mean, this is why I love the era of social media that we're in. I love being on TikTok, the whole trend of like, how hard can it be? A man does it. That's like a pop. And they're using that for Kamala Harris's campaign too, of like, how hard can it be? Men do it, boys do it. And also the idea that like, what is construction but large scale arts and crafts? Yeah, women, let's get out there. Let's do this. Let's build houses. Like by encouraging one another, we can sort of start to pick apart and overcome these toxic myths, but to do it in a way that's sort of humorous and accessible and allows you to take small bites instead of having to scarf down a whole meal and have indigestion, right?
It is. And I think, I think this is one of the beautiful things about social media is you actually can use it to start deconstructing a lot of these myths. I mean, it's for me, that comes into like with my cooking, and the fact that like whenever people are surprised when you read my book that I have recipes at the end of it, people are surprised that I love to cook. And I always love doing it for members of the church or when we have different groups over, because it is not expected, but it's something that I find deep value in and love. And so much so, Julia, that I have the items I need to deliver to you.
Oh my God, I was literally about to bring it up. I was about to say.
I know. I owe
Julia. But what about?
I bought it. I haven't made it yet. I owe Julia. Julia has had to help out with Isaiah quite a bit the last few weeks.
You owe me nothing. Traveling. It's my pleasure.
Well,
that's my baby boo.
I know, but I made some corn chowder. I'm gonna make some corn chowder. I have all this stuff, so I can bring it over there. It's one of the things that I make. Blair, one of the craziest things, and I'll say this as a means of us wrapping up, is like being in California. I came to California and I was like, all I eat is this particular kind of, Midwestern, Southern versions of soul food. But now that I'm here, it's just like, honestly, like one of the, like my students, when I'm talking to them about like cooking or whatnot, like my favorite things to eat now are like pizza, like good Italian pizza, and tacos. Like I love tacos, and I like tacos, okay. And then I moved to San Diego, and I was just like, you cannot beat a good, like, tacos are quick, easy, and like they're delicious. It is.
But also, what
amazing.
a beautiful aspect of your humanity that you get to encounter and celebrate. Right, to bring it back full circle to the beginning of this conversation, right? Toxic masculinity steals the fullness of humanity from men and from women. So making and celebrating and sharing good food, that doesn't belong to a gender, right?
Exactly.
That's outrageous to think that loving good food and wanting to know how to make it and share it is just something that women get to do. Like, you are probably 10 times the cook that I will ever be. And how beautiful that you get to live in a world and in a church that says, yes, Dr. Carter should make us corn chowder because he's the best person to do it.
Absolutely.
Regardless of whatever gender he performs today or tomorrow. And so like that is the kind of thing that we get when we embrace an egalitarian and a feminist perspective, where we get to say people get to be the full version of whoever they want to be, are made to be, feel as if they should be, and that is what the body is meant to be, right? We don't get the full body of Christ when each individual body is not getting to be their full selves. And even I would argue that egalitarian and patriarchal churches don't even get the full body of Christ, because they can't make a full body because they don't even know what it feels to be a full human themselves. And so that is the liberation that you're seeking, is that each individual gets to be fully themselves, fully embrace the imago Dei, the fullness of God within themselves. And then that's how we get to a community that actually resembles the body of Christ. So,
and Julia gets to get corn chowder. I'm like, and everybody wins.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win for everyone. Well, Blair, we're so grateful to have you on with us.
So glad to be with you guys. I hope we get to do it again.
Oh no, definitely gonna do it again. Because even as we're having this conversation around toxic masculinity, I think, I told you I'd love to have not only a conversation around your research, because I think that's important, but around what it means to think about this with respect to how we parent and raise our kids. And you and I
lots of ways, lots of things this touches. And I was a little bit, so again, you said spoiler, like I do feminist theology in relation to evangelism and missiology. And there was part of me that was worried to go into naming myself as a feminist theologian or going down that track, because there's been pushback against like, well, angry feminists, which I would also argue is a form of toxic gender expression. But yeah, the idea that feminism is just embracing the full humanity of both women and men and non-binary people and the full expression of gender, right? Like, it's not as terrifying as people make it out to be, or as binary as people make it out to be. And I think in some ways we have to reclaim feminism as much as we have to push back against toxic masculinity. So, little snippet for another day.
Little snippet, little podcast preview. All right, so thanks for joining us for the Progressive Christians podcast. If you would like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can visit our website, which is right now hosted on theloftla.org. And we're going to have our own Instagram feed and everything else coming up soon. It hasn't been rolled out yet, but it's going to be the next few weeks. Again, we want to invite you to rate, review, subscribe to us so that we can continue to provide you with this amazing progressive Christian content. We want to thank you all for being a part of the conversation, and we will see you all next time. Bye.
Bye. Bye.